welcome everybody. We are very excited to have you here. It's going to be a great conversation interpreting cross-cultural research. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions and a lot of good stuff to talk through. Let me make sure I can move the slide down. There we go. Really quick, one of the traditions we have here at PSRF is to welcome new attendees. So if this is your first time joining a PSRF event, if you want to take yourself off mute and say hello, we would love to hear from you. No? All right, feel free to take yourself off mute if you have questions or anything else as we go forward. We'd love to see your face and say hello. Next, really quick, we'd like to offer up the opportunity for anyone who is looking for a new role to kind of raise their hand and say hello and maybe give a little background on what they're looking for. I know this has been a huge transition. I've gotten to meet a lot of new people through my work who have recently been hired into the universe, as well as I've had to say a lot of goodbyes. So any employers online who are looking to hire? Remember, we have, oh, yes.
We are looking for a VP of marketing at Seagull Scientific. And we're also looking for a director of marketing communications as well, but that job may not be advertised at the moment. So if anyone's looking to become a VP of marketing, please let me know. It's in the barcoding and labeling industry and supply chain management, that sort of stuff.
Supply chain, so busy these days. Could you put that link, if you have it, in chat for everyone?
Yeah, I'll do that. Give me a minute. Oh, it'll be in the chat.
And before we move on too quickly, just a brief thank you, a very heartfelt thank you to all of our annual sponsors. They make all of this so much easier to do, and they help us have the resources to do hybrid, to do events, to bring great speakers to you. So thank you to Blink, Focus Institute, Fieldwork, GMA Research, Holland Partners, Hemispheres, Full Circle Research Company, M Agency, the Insights Association, the West Chapter, as well as the AMA of Puget Sound. We are very excited to have your members joining us. So thank you for that sponsorship. And before I pass it along too quickly to Josh Lamar, just a quick intro for him. And Josh, please feel free to build on this. But Josh is the co-founder and CEO of Amplinate. They are a strategic thought partner that helps companies fast track product research and strategy to save millions by building the right product for the right people domestically and internationally. So there could not be anyone better than him just to help us think about international research and cross-cultural research in new and creative ways. So Josh, thank you very much for being with us today. And I will go ahead and pass it to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I am been very much looking forward to this talk, and I'm very excited to be here. This is such a fun topic, and one I will actually give more of a cultural introduction of sorts at the beginning of my talk. So actually I'm going to just start the presentation because that's where we're going to go. While I'm getting that up, one of the things, kind of some background to start, was that this talk actually came up because I did another talk with the Puget Sound Research Forum. Was it last year or the year before? It's kind of like COVID blur, but it was on remote research. And we had such a great discussion around remote international research that the idea came up like, oh, you should just do a talk on international research. So I'm going to be using cross-cultural and international back and forth, and there are some slight differences. As an example, you can have cross-cultural research happen within your own country, and you can have cross-cultural research happen between different countries. And there are different nuances that happen there when you're looking at things like language. But that's, so I'm calling this interpreting cross-cultural data, but it's really about approaching international research, making sense of cross-cultural data as well. Also, I just want to apologize in advance for my voice. I am recovering from COVID. So I have some water hopefully I'm going to be okay. And I might have to cough off screen while I turn my mic off, just FYI. So there it is. That is the introduction. As I said, we're going to talk about my own personal cross-cultural journey as a means of introduction. Some general thoughts on culture and kind of approaches to what culture means when we talk about culture. Some key factors to think about when it comes to culture. And then I say steps to interpreting cross-cultural data. They can go in any order. Like I have like a progression, but these are all things that you can kind of like take little bits of. And my hope is that these are all going to be very interesting things to you that you can use to, you know, start the process of thinking cross-culturally. As we go along, since we're a nice, you know, small group, if there are questions, I'll kind of pause at the end of each section to ask for questions. Because of Zoom, it's very hard to watch the chat also. So I'm just gonna not look at the chat, but if you put a question in the chat, somebody stop me at the at the moment, and we'll get there. Thank you, Joelle. All right. So as a means of introduction, I go back to 1997 as one of the touch points in my cross-cultural journey, because it's a regret. It's actually one of the biggest regrets looking back, is that I had an opportunity to spend as a foreign exchange student in Heidelberg, Germany, and I didn't take it. I had learned German all through high school, and I, for some reason, thought, oh, this is so important. I have to like keep going through high school and go to college and get a degree and get a job. And I look back now with my hindsight of 2020, and I layers on that one too. And I think, wow, you know, this is really such a missed opportunity, because as my career has progressed, I have also continued to find all of these ways that culture really informs my perspective on the world, and how much richer of an experience I could have had if I had done that. As I jumping ahead a little bit, in 2004, I was a localization PM at Microsoft. And this was right smack in the middle of my grad school program at UW, and the HCDE program. It was then technical communication. But I was working as a web developer, site manager, localization PM. And all of a sudden, my very first day of the job, I had a website in English, and then I had the translation in a Word document of the same website in French, German, Spanish, Italian, Chinese simplified, Chinese traditional, Korean, and Japanese. And my first job was, okay, code the site in all these languages. Like, okay, so I had studied German. I knew a little bit of German, but all of a sudden, like, you take the same thing and do it in Japanese, like, oh, wow. So then I, you know, learned about like what periods look like in Japanese. Like periods in Japanese look like little circles. Thought that was really interesting. And you pick up on these, just these little things. And then I would start talking to the subsidiaries and showing them the website and getting feedback on the translation, and then working with the translation vendor to update the translation memory with how we're going to translate these phrases. And then you pick up little things like, how do you sign an email in French? How do you sign it in any of these other languages? Obviously, I couldn't really do it in Japanese, but I could do it correctly in French and German, and learn some things in Spanish. And it just started my curiosity, piquing my curiosity around working with other people around the world, because all of a sudden I went from not having a lot of international experiences. If I were to add one more, it'd be the year 2000. I spent the semester studying poetry in England, and went to Germany for a weekend and fell in love with it again, and decided, okay, I'm going to take more German. And so that's kind of funny, because all of a sudden all of these new experiences and people and ideas and ways of communicating keep coming back. And then in 2013, we're jumping ahead a little bit some more, I did my first international ethnographic study in Brazil, China, and Japan. Now, I also happened to meet my Italian Brazilian husband when I was in Japan. And this is kind of where things start really coming together, because as a researcher, I was a researcher at Microsoft at the time, and we were looking at how people look for information online. And I did the same project in these 3 countries, but I was in people's homes. And so my first time in Brazil was to visit people in their homes. My first time in China and Japan, same thing. I was visiting people in their homes and really connecting with people. And I was surprised and shocked that, you know, we could just talk and we had a translator that was there helping us out. But it was really beautiful. And also, again, as I said, I met my husband in Japan. He was living in Japan. But being a queer person, I identify with this queer community and then have to function in these kind of other spaces that are non-queer spaces in the USA. And that translation of looking at what it feels like to be a part of one group and not a part of another group, and the variation and going back and forth between those things, I think is actually really helpful in thinking about cross-cultural research, because there are groups that we are parts of and there are groups that we are not a part of. And we start to see things differently when we're looking at the in-group versus the out-group and who belong and the role of belonging. Because I didn't belong to any of these cultures when I was there, and yet at the same time I was welcomed. And at the same time, I was able to have some really beautiful conversations with people, which I'll share some of the stories in this talk in the future. And so part of where this led me was actually, I took a sabbatical in 2019 to come to France. And why France? Because I studied all this German. Well, I did a bunch of research projects in France when I was with Microsoft, and just really fell in love with Paris as a city. And it just became a place that, like, actually, you know, it's a good time. It was my 40th birthday present to myself to take the sabbatical and really focus on learning French, because I wanted to study French poetry and philosophy. But then, of course, out of that came the creation of my company to really focus on cross-cultural research, because this is a thing that, as the timeline shows, has been an interest. But it just keeps getting deeper the longer that I've been in these kinds of different roles and had these aspects of cross-cultural communication and research show up. And it just became something that I loved, and I want to really promote this in the industry, because we don't really do enough cross-cultural or international research in general. And by doing more of it, we're actually opening the door to inclusive design by listening to people's voices from around the world that we wouldn't normally listen to, but we create better products because of that. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from as I'm talking about culture. So let's kind of shift into like some ideas about culture. I'm going to start with a quote that I came across recently from Robert Garland. Culture is how people behaves, lives, thinks, with what their values and aspirations are, and how they see themselves as a people. I really liked this because I think that it's encompassing a very holistic perspective, because culture is something that is not, culture is something that's not static. It's a very living and breathing thing, and it changes and it's constantly moving. And it's also very holistic. There's not one way to look at culture, because there are so many different lenses that we can look at culture through. But deep down, it comes to how people behave, how they live and they think, their values, their aspirations. David Foster Wallace begins a commencement speech entitled "This is Water" in this way. There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And this is such a great metaphor for culture, because like the fish has no idea what the water is, culture is something that we don't really understand until we leave it. And so as I started traveling more often for work, as I started doing international research, as I moved to another country, and I've lived in Paris since 2019 now, so 3 years, you start to see not only your home culture differently, you see your kind of new home culture in a new way. And then you start seeing your home culture through the lens of your now new adopted culture. But it's getting out of the water to see, oh, this is what's what's going on here. This is this culture. You may have experienced culture shock at some point, and that's a really interesting like thing. And I've had some very strong, very difficult moments of culture shock in my life. One of the examples, I actually went to Chile with my best friend who is from Chile. And my friend group when I was living in Seattle was mostly Hispanic people that all spoke Spanish natively, and then my husband who was Brazilian. And I was studying Spanish actually at the time as well because I love languages and just can't get enough of it. And I had this moment, even though I was with my best friends in the world, I had this moment of culture shock where all of a sudden I felt uncomfortable. I felt scared. I had this big fear of like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Because I realized that there's an entire world outside of the world that I live in that speaks Spanish that I couldn't understand, that was existing in this whole universe. And it's a really powerful feeling. If you've ever had culture shock, I don't recommend it. It's not great. I had to like go to a safe space and like I'd like go back to the hotel and just like, you know, do like read something in English just so that I felt okay. But like it's that moment where you're like, oh wow, this is like having a really big effect on me. And that is such an important thing because as we travel internationally, it's very easy to have the vacation experience around what it is to experience a culture, but living in a culture is very different as well. And so as you're moving into the different places around the world and traveling to different cities, really digging in and experiencing how different it is can really help you to feel that difference. And it sometimes is not pleasant, but at the same time, it's important to feel that uncomfortableness because you realize that the system is much bigger and broader and more complex than you thought it was. Which is actually my next point around culture being a really complex system of meaning making. And I'm actually going to be drawing from Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems here, which I love. But it's really all of these ways in which culture exists in these really complex systems that's really hard to make sense of. And it's not necessarily what I think it means, but what does it mean for these other people that are in the system? What does it mean for them? How does a product function in this complex system? How do the relationships that we have with people and technology shift when we're in a different system? Life, work, friend group, culture, these are all things that are constantly shifting and moving, and we create meaning based on what it is that we're trying to make sense of. And we all come to the meaning making from a different perspective. There's a Sufi story of the blind men and the elephants, which you may have heard before. But as Donella Meadows tells the story, she then says the ancient Sufi story was told to teach a simple lesson, but one that we often ignore. The behavior of a system cannot be known just by knowing the elements of which the system is made. And this, I just want to pause for a second here. I'm going to repeat that. There we go. The behavior of a system cannot be known just by knowing the elements of which the system is made. So if we're taking culture as a way of evaluating or if we're looking at, say, a product in another culture, and we're looking at elements of culture, we can't understand that culture just by understanding the parts of the whole. It's bigger and more complex than that, and it's something that is difficult to kind of pin down. So we have to come into approaching cross-cultural research from this perspective of not actually being able to know, but being able to learn, being able to find out. Like one of the things I love about Carol Dweck and the growth mindset is that it's not, I know this, or I'm this way. It's, I can learn, or I can figure it out. And I think that that's part of the skill set needed when we're really trying to make sense of things in cross-cultural data, because people are messy and they don't make sense. And you get a whole bunch of people in any system, and not everything is going to make sense because they're complex. So another aspect of kind of how I think about culture is around semiotics, anthropology, and product strategy. So essentially all of these three things kind of like create this Venn diagram in my head where in semiotics, we're looking at how do we create meaning? In anthropology, we're looking at how do we understand people from other cultures? And in product strategy, we're looking at how do we build products that people want to use and thus that sell? And all of these things together are an interplay in cross-cultural research. So I have a couple ideas around this because I'm going to use a reference culture and the foreign culture. And for the sake of ease, we'll use the USA as the reference culture, though some of you might be international. I myself am an American, but I live internationally. And a foreign culture would be the culture that you're going to go do your research in or learn about something. And there's this element of the conscious and the unconscious that happens with both, because I might not be aware of all of the American isms of what it means to be American, but then I look at the foreign culture and I see, oh, these are all these different things about what it is to be French. At the same time, the participant that I would be, interviewing isn't going to be aware of all of the French things that make them French, but they will be aware of the Americanness of what makes someone American. So there's this constant tension between the things that we know and are conscious of and our unconscious biases around what else could be going on. And so as it gets more complex, we actually have this kind of layer of confirmation bias that we're unaware of. And then we're typically aware of our value systems. We know what we think about the world. We know what we value, what we think is important. Like in America, we know it's important to work hard. That's a value, or a cultural mythology that we tell ourselves about what it means to be American, really. But this interplay between our known values and our confirmation biases impact what we think that we know, what we think that we think about the other culture, what we believe to be true about ourselves and about the other culture, and the things that we notice. And I think the notice is one of the most important aspects here, because your confirmation biases that are coming from your reference culture are going to inform the kinds of things that you notice or take or observe when you are looking at the foreign culture. And in the foreign culture, there's also this kind of subjective and objective ways of looking at things. There are things that people do, actions people take, behaviors they have, like these are all very measurable things. And then there's subjectively, what do they think about those things? What do they believe to be true about their culture, about the product that you're studying, about the topic or the system that you're evaluating? And there's also how they evaluate it. So all of these things get really messy. And then just to kind of put another perspective on this, you have your reference culture. Let's say that this is me on the left and I'm looking through the lens of the USA. So look at this foreign culture. And then you have the participant in the foreign culture that are looking at this product from the USA. And then they're also looking at this other product from a local company. And what ends up happening is that there are all these layers that are kind of like happening at these multiple at the same time, and we're unconscious of a lot of them. So I want to pause right here because it's kind of the end of the section, because I see that there are chats happening. I'd love to hear kind of any questions that have come up so far.
Thanks, Josh. This is making me think so much. We don't have any specific questions for you yet, but
okay.
One of the things that you mentioned that I would love you to, I have a question, I guess.
Okay.
So you mentioned kind of the vacation experience and the cultural experience. And what I'm getting from your work and kind of where you're leading is that the cultural experience is where product works, right? If I'm introducing or if I'm changing a product, I need it to be at the cultural experience. I can't let it be just at that vacation experience, which is why the lenses are so important. It's like why you can't stop at the top layer. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to summarize it, because essentially, if we only have a vacation experience, you're not going to have an experience that is in the shoes of your foreign culture participants, or to use the other metaphor, you're not jumping in their water. You're taking a look at it from a side, and you're staying in a hotel. Like, okay, most people don't live in hotels. You're eating at fancy restaurants because that's what you do when you're on vacation. most people eat at home and don't eat at fancy restaurants every day. Like all of a sudden you just start taking out some of these things like, okay, well, is this how people actually live? Like, no, it's not how people live. And so you can like go to Paris. Paris is a great example, just because, not just because I'm here, but because everyone has some idea of Paris. And there's actually a word in Japanese for the sadness that you feel when Japanese people come to Paris and they realize that it's a real city, that it's gritty, and that it's not utter perfection. And if you've been to Japan, you know that everything is so clean everywhere. And there's literally this word for this feeling, that this experience that they have when they come, because Paris is, everyone has all these ideas about Paris. And so you can have the kind of the tourist experience, but it's not a local experience. David has a question.
I used to live in Tokyo, and it's called Paris syndrome in English.
Paris syndrome?
Yes, not to be confused with Jerusalem syndrome, which is when people go to the Holy Land and then believe they're Jesus. But yes, Paris syndrome, you're right. I'm gonna let you continue.
What is the Japanese?
Sorry?
Do you know it in Japanese?
No, I never learned Japanese. I'll talk about that in the Q&A though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excited. I'm excited. Because I did research in Japan, and my husband lived in Japan. So we have a lot of fun things with Japan. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so some key factors to consider, and I'm just going to do a time check also. Right. So communication styles is definitely an important one to take note of. Direct versus indirect communication probably being one of the most important. In Germany, in the Netherlands, for example, very direct culture. They say exactly what they mean, and they say it very matter-of-factly. Versus indirect communication, again, we'll use Japan as another example. Japan and the UK are two of the most indirect cultures on planet Earth. And my favorite is, of course, the British, my only concern, which is a lovely, confusing thing in British English. Does anyone know this? And actually, this is actually why whenever we do research in the UK, we use a local moderator, and we highly, and sometimes people even say like, oh no, you can moderate. Like, nope, we're not going to moderate it. Why? Because we understand the nuances of a language that sounds like we understand it, that we call English, but we speak it a different way. And so my only concern to an American might sound like, oh yeah, just fix this one thing. My only concern is just fix this one thing and it'll be fine. And when a British person says it, it actually means this is a deal breaker and I will not use this if it has this thing or it does not have this thing, which is very difficult for Americans. Another fun thing that we've done is jumping ahead, but is that we would do a quiz show of what did the British person actually mean when they said something, and we would, quiz the group of the observers, and say, hey, what did the participant mean when they said this? And then we ask our British moderator, hey, what did this person actually mean? And this is very difficult because a lot of things are kind of implied or understated in British English. And confirmation is another example. Sometimes confirmation is implied, and sometimes like Americans are very direct and clear in this aspect of you have to state everything. I will be doing this by this time. Yes, I will get this done. And in other cultures, in India, for example, one of our earlier projects that we had done with them, I remember one of our researchers was reaching out to them and had said something like, oh yeah, and I think we need to get this done, blah, blah, blah. And then they had started working on it, but we didn't know that. And then the researcher wrote back, was like, oh, hey, so do you think you can do this? And then the partner was like, oh, actually, it's already like almost done. Here it is. And so there's a lot of this kind of implied confirmations that are very explicit in American English. Also, important to note that moderation in general is very different across markets. And so it's important that if you think something about the moderator and their style, what you might consider to be rude isn't necessarily rude in that other culture. A great example is moderating in Germany. because a lot of times, I think one of my favorite moderators I've ever worked with ever, she's very direct and it's like boom, 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 boom. But you know what? The participants, not a problem, not considered rude. She gets a lot done. And you might be off-putting to an American to have someone moderating in such a style, but to them, it's like not a problem at all. So work habits, another important aspect here, which it will relate to my next point as well, but time zones and working hours and the perception of time. Like this is another aspect of culture, the perception of time. Is it important to be on time? How long is it okay to be late before it's rude? What if you go over? Is it rude to go over? In the culture map by Erin Meyer, she talks about speaking in Brazil and how in Brazil, she showed up on time, but no one was there and she thought everyone was rude. And then she like gave the presentation and then ended right on time. And then found out later that the Brazilians who were there loved the presentation, really wanted to talk more. And that by cutting it off on time, she was actually being rude to them because the Brazilian perception of time is just so different because it's about appreciating the current moment, not necessarily about being at a certain time. So that's a really fun example. I have a link to the book later in the presentation. But it's also important to really understand people's working habits, because as you're working with people from other cultures, they might not always do things exactly the same way that you do. And so it's really important. Planning ahead is another one. We were working on a project in Indonesia, and it was like, we had talked to the recruitment partner and they were like, yeah, okay, so here's the window for recruitment. Can we do it this way? And they were like, oh, you know, actually, yeah, we have this window, but typically it just works this other way. And it's all gonna happen at the end. And by the time the study is gonna happen, it's not gonna be a problem, but you're not gonna see as much the first week. And so they, okay. And sometimes a lot of big, like, I think that the big takeaway of international research is understand what the custom is and just go with it, because you can't change the way that people work, but you can let them work within the systems that they're in, and like it all works out in the end. And that's the fun part. Local laws and customs. This is probably like the whole, like there's so many nuances. So the important takeaway here is ask and find a local person, your recruitment partner, moderator, someone that's from that country. Like, you can't ask about skin color in France. There's one. It's a very simple one but a lot of times if you wanted to do like a study with Black people in France, well, you can't ask like, are you Black? But you can ask things like, what country were you born in? How long have you lived in France? Things like that. So it's a slight nuance, but that's a whole other topic that I can go off on about France. Local laws and off work hours, like in Germany, you can't work after a certain stated time, and they won't. And so if you send an email at a certain like 01 after, like they're not going to get it till the next day, which means you can lose time if you're trying to collaborate with people in Europe. It's a very different mentality. And religious and national holidays, very important to understand what they are, when they are, and how it potentially affects doing research in those countries. We had one client that was adamant that we had to do research during Ramadan in a predominantly Muslim country. Didn't work so well. They didn't really like hearing that we couldn't do it at the time that they wanted, but we also can't change Ramadan. Similarly in Brazil, during Carnival, like there's absolutely no way that anything is going to happen during that week. Everyone is, that's what the country does. So, or similarly in August in Europe, like nothing really happens in August in Europe. Everyone's on vacation. And you have to just ask around to understand these things, and then you work around them. And then there's also the cultural perception of your company and your brand. And this gets a lot more pronounced in the East, as things could be from the West or from America versus a local company that does the same thing. And what really is going on here, which I kind of touched on at the beginning of the talk, was this idea of belonging, that local products are made for us versus this is a product that's made for people in America. It's not made for us. And of course, the goal is to really build products for people that feels like it's made for them, that feels like it's authentic to who they are and the cultural nuances of that particular system that they're in. And last, there's also the localization of brand names. And this one is a really tricky one because there's some localization issue that comes up, I think, in every single study that I've ever worked on. And you never know what it is, because if we knew all of these things at the get-go, well, we just design something differently. But I think specifically with brand names, and specifically with countries that don't always speak English very, very well. And it comes up in France even, because a lot of people in France do speak English. But then if you have a brand name that looks like a French word, but it's just missing an accent, suddenly they're going to think that it's just misspelled without the accent, which means a different word entirely. And then they're going to be completely confused as to what your product does, because they think that they understand the word, but they don't. But it's because the brand name just hadn't been localized. And it would be something completely different if they did, but no, they wanted to use the American word, like, okay, here's the American English word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And then it happens in other countries too, like in Brazil, a lot of people don't speak a lot of English in Brazil. And so they'll kind of have like no idea what it's talking about. And they're like, why is this like just in English? Why can't they just localize this? And so it's a really tricky one. But that the idea being that there is this perception, and when you're coming in doing research in another country and you're coming in representing your company, either known or unknown to the participants, or even the brand, they're going to have a perception of your company and your brand, or even your country. They just have a perception of Americans. Have lots of really fascinating conversations with French people about the perception of Americans, and it's very fun because they like to ask questions too, and they like to debate, and they like to have these debates about like how things really are. And it's really fun, but everyone has that perception. So it's being aware of what your own perceptions are, what your own biases are, so that when you come across something that's different, you're not judging it.
Hey, Josh.
A moment for, yeah.
Oh, my timing was good. Thank you.
Your timing is perfect.
I'm glad. So one question from Anne, and let me read it to you because it's a really good question. How do you account for those communication styles when designing surveys? Do you design completely a different survey for different languages, depending on the language and culture, or is it possible to tweak? And I'm sure there's many nuances, she says, but I'm just curious in how you approach this. And then building on that, similar for interviews, how do you think about your qual in that way as well? And Anne, please chime in if I missed anything.
Okay.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute, but I think you nailed it. You read it aloud, just great.
Perfect.
Just curious about how you account for this in your work, Josh.
Yeah, it's really important to ask so if you're the recruitment partner, your survey research partner, someone local. I think we're a qual company, so but I think that the approach would be the same, irrespective of quant versus qual, because the how you ask a question is important either way. And also I think in recruitment as well, like I mentioned, I think earlier in the call, as we are understanding the kind of the local way of doing things. So as a perfect example, like if we wanted to get Black people in France, we can't ask that question. So we have to ask a different but related question when we're doing recruitment. And I think that that's probably the best analogy, because there might be certain things that you can or can't do that are going to be different in each market, or ways there are things that you can ask about. Another example was in Indonesia. They're very positive, like happy people, and they don't like to talk about things that are negative or things that I think the question was if they blocked someone, and like we had to like reframe it into something more positive because of how they would feel when they answered it, because they don't want to be negative in their responses or in a negative critique or judgment of a person. So I think that those are kind of two different examples, but the answer is definitely like try to understand what you can and can't do, and then adjust accordingly. There was another project that we did on a very like sensitive, like difficult topic to talk about. And we had to use a completely different strategy for how we did the recruitment in 3 different markets. And it was because some markets are very open to having conversations about whatever topic it is. Another market was very regimented, and we had a very strict, like, these are the questions you can ask, these are the questions you can't ask. And then a third market was just another strategy entirely that was kind of a mix between the two. And so it's important to understand and be flexible. And yet at the same time, if you're doing survey research, I understand that you want to ask the same question. So I think that in that case, where you really want to compare data across 3 different markets, that finding the most acceptable question format for each of the markets so that you can ask it in as close to exactly the same way as possible would be a good approach there, because in the end, you want to compare data points, and you can't compare that if you change the question too much. And in qualitative research, you can change your approach slightly, and it's less of a problem than if you're trying to do like data point comparisons. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, totally. I'm also just wondering too if there's like survey styles that are better. So, for instance, Kano was, I understand, was developed in Japan. To me, the survey format feels really awkward to go through and say, how much do you like this feature? And then later, like, would you be upset if that feature wasn't included? From an American point of view, it feels weird every time I hear or see it. But I wonder then if it isn't, like, is there a cultural element there where that kind of questioning is more appropriate than just sort of like, please stack rank these features in order of preference, right?
I mean, I don't think anyone in any culture thinks about features the way that we do. And while I am a fan of Kano, we tend to do it more qualitatively because it's about the conversation and less about like the number. And I think that there's the graphic of like the NPS score on Windows, and like if anyone's seen this, someone like typed it in, you can find this somewhere on the internet. Like, I want you to understand that people do not go around recommending operating systems to each other, to their friends and family. And I think like that's the bigger problem here. Like,
right.
People don't think about products like we do. So the better option is to try to use the language that people would use in whatever culture that is, and then just ask them normal questions that they understand, because they don't talk about features.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're at the steps part, and I said I put this in a progression, but you can do this out of order. And like I said before, culture is constantly changing. It's growing. It's dynamic. And there's no single silver bullet to like do this the right way. There's a lot of different approaches, and it's about trying to be open and learn as you go. And so this is probably my most text-heavy slide in the presentation. And this idea starts with up-leveling your insights with an experiential immersion. And what I mean by that is to learn as much as you can about this new culture that you're trying to learn about through as many different sources and angles that you can. Articles, documentaries, films, books. This might seem really basic, and some people might call it desk research. And what I'm advocating here is something deeper than desk research. It's not spending an hour on Google. It's actually creating experiences through different lenses of understanding a culture. And I have a bunch of slides here about maps, history, politics, language, art, music, literature, and food. These are meant to be prompts of things to think about and ways to have experiences. Because again, it's not about taking a magnifying glass and looking at the other culture. It's not about taking binoculars and looking across the Atlantic Ocean and looking at Europe. It's actually about going to Europe. It's about getting in the water. I'm just going to keep using this water metaphor because I love it. It's about getting in the water. It's getting out of your pool and getting into their pool and seeing what it's like. And a lot of times it's easy to skip this, but you have to really be curious and start digging in, because the goal here is really to create opportunities for connection with other people. Because when you connect to people, you allow them to share their stories. So where are they in the world? I have done projects in countries that our clients have had to look up where they are on the map. And what are the countries are around? How close are they to the next other language? What are the religious or political affiliations of the bordering countries? What season is it now? Like, it seems silly and easy. Yes, these are easy to find out. But when it's storming in Brazil, like in December, they have like big storms in Brazil. It can affect the internet, which can affect your ability to do research in Brazil online. Like little things, but they actually affect how you do research. And storms in Brazil are not fun. They're as close as I can think of. They're kind of like Austin. If you've been in a storm in Austin before, not fun. History. What are the key dates in the history of the country? Major wars that determine the course of the country, or achieving independence. Are they a colonizer? Are they a colonized country? They're all important questions to have an understanding of, because as soon as you start talking to people from that country, it's important to have a general sense of some of the things that are, you know, really important in the history of their lives, their parents' lives, their families' lives. Politics, you know, what political system are they in? Who is their current leader, president, dictator? How long have they been in power, etc. I'm just going to go through these quickly. I'm going to send the link to the deck, or y'all will get the deck. I'll send a PDF that can be sent out to you. Language is, I think, one of my favorite ones, especially when you're visiting another country, because especially when we like to do cultural immersion research projects, which are research projects that are here in Paris. We've done a few of them in Paris now, but it's experiential, and it's about all of these different things, because you have to learn and understand and look at culture from all of these different angles in order to have a better experience. And just learning a little bit about the language can go a really long way, especially in France. For example, do you know how to say hello and goodbye, please and thank you, I would like? These are the most important things that you can learn, and it is not too difficult. There's a little pronunciation, but you know what? People are really kind when you say, hello, I would like, and then point. They're very, very understanding. And showing that little bit, just saying thank you in the new language, means so much to people, because it's a way to connect. Another fun one, and I'm just gonna do a plug for the Spotify Top 50 playlist. It's really interesting because you can get a sense of a culture, musically, by listening to the top 50 of each country. What does it feel, what does it sound like to be in a mall in Brazil? Like, what songs would you hear? Or in the taxi or Uber when you're in Paris moving around? Like, you're gonna hear different songs in different languages. What does it sound like? Again, it's not just knowing that it's this artist is famous. It's about experiencing that music, or reading that poem or that book, or going to a museum and actually seeing that piece of artwork. It's the experience that allows you to connect. And my other favorite one is food, because food is something that brings everyone together, and everyone, no matter where they're from, can talk about their regional cuisines, their favorite dishes, restaurant recommendations of where you can go to eat them. And also maybe you could make it at home. And again, just knowing that there is a regional cuisine, or that the food in the country that you're looking at is something that's much deeper and more rich than you expected, is one of those beautiful moments of appreciating culture, because you might not know, and then it opens up an entirely new world. And again, the goal is really to help connect with others. And you can connect with many different people, both during your research and before and after. Talking to friends, coworkers, satellite office employees that are from that culture. If you are lucky enough to have a friend in the place that you're going, talk to them about their experience. Seek to understand, not to be understood. This is so, so important because it's not about sharing what your ideas of that culture are. It's about listening to them share their stories about their experience in that culture. And you can really develop a connection with people with simultaneous interpreters. It works beautifully. I remember this moment when I was in Brazil doing research with our interpreter, and I think she had like gone to the bathroom or something, and then the participant just started asking me all these questions in Portuguese, and I had to kind of like smile and laugh because I didn't know what to do, because the little voice in your head that's telling you all the things in English, like when that voice goes away, you just had no idea that it was even there. It's really funny, but it works really, really well. And I think we both laughed at that moment because we realized like, oh yeah, I don't actually understand. But we could have a really human moment. And that's a way to really like break down those barriers between language and between culture, to just have an experience, have a human experience with people. And then of course, you're going to observe interactions through ethnography, through in-home visits, however you want to call them. They can happen online. You can observe things online. Obviously being there and having that experience is so much better, which I'm so happy for post-COVID world, crossing my fingers there. But you know, this is one of the biggest, most important experiences that we can have as researchers, is actually feeling what it's like to live in another country. And you can't actually have all of those feelings, but you can develop compassion for the people that you're doing research with, that will help you to get a better sense of why things matter or why things are different. I have a little do and don't list here, and I'm not going to read all of these, but essentially it's this idea of digging into emotions, motivations, behaviors, trying to understand why people do what they do, what it means, and thinking very holistically. You're stepping into their water, into their pool, not just looking at it from afar. And again, it's not about criticizing the other culture, it's about understanding. And it's about taking your own ideas and your own hypotheses and setting them aside, because we don't know. And that's the most exciting part about this. I'm just going to pause for a second. Were there any other questions?
You do have a question, and it's from Helen, and she says, how do you reconcile differences in the findings from different cultures, such as the values people resonate with and a product may be different? How do you reconcile that and offer a unifying point of recommended action? And then she builds on that with, do you have any resources that you recommend for holding those in-field immersion activities?
Oof, okay, two big ones. It's really hard because it's about how something makes sense within each system. So does your product make sense in culture A, B, and C? And there might be things that resonate in cultures A and B, but not C. And that's okay, because it's not about forcing the square peg into the round hole. It's about adapting your product in order to better resonate with what does resonate in those markets. I have a whole section later on about this very soon. So I'm just going to tease that for now, and just say, I think that it's really difficult. And when you try to force something to fit that doesn't fit, it's better to acknowledge that it just doesn't fit, and that you can't have the same strategy for a single product across the entire world. It's not possible. It's about how you tweak it to resonate with what does work in those markets. And if your product doesn't resonate in those markets, figure out what does resonate and why people are using what they're using. And what was the second part of the question?
It was around recommendations for holding in-field immersion activities. You mentioned cooking, you mentioned kind of, in-person one-on-ones, that kind of thing. What else?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can turn, it depends on what your product is and kind of the goals of the research that you want to have. Like we try to make all of our like research experiences because they're holistic experiences that are looking at it from different angles. So I think it really depends on kind of the topic area, but anything that you can do to help your team or your stakeholders to think about the world in a different way. Like an example that I came up with, didn't end up doing this sadly, because there wasn't enough time, but I wanted to give each teams of people the amount of money that normal people in France would have to go have dinner, and then drop them off in a market and say, figure out dinner, but you only have this amount of money. Because it's really easy to think, especially as Americans coming into France, think, oh, everything is so inexpensive, we can have everything. But then if you look at like, okay, well, this is what normal people make in Paris, and here's how much they would have for dinner. And here's like, figure out what they would do. All of a sudden, you're having a different experience. And that's the goal. I have links to these in the appendix, but I mentioned the culture map by Erin Meyer earlier. There's also Edward Hall's cultural factors and Hofstede's cultural dimensions model. You can use these cultural dimension theories as guidelines for your analysis. It can help, as an example, in the culture map, Erin Meyer talks about the perception of time and the indirect versus direct communication. Another factor is giving negative feedback. That's a really important one to understand when you're asking for negative feedback about your product. And I think that there are some similar ones in these other models as well. It can help direct you. It's not like any one of these is a silver bullet, but they're helpful in order to get an idea of the landscape of what you might come across. Just another tidbit in terms of the book recommendation, we buy the culture map for every employee that joins us. And we actually, whenever we're finding new employees, we're looking for people that have had these kinds of like important international experiences in their past. Because having international experiences and speaking other languages really shifts the way that you perceive the world and your own and new home cultures. And so we've created this community of people they're really international in that way. And so reading this is just something that energizes everybody when they start with us, because we are able to apply these concepts like daily, like immediately. And so anyway, that's my recommendation, but these are all very, very good. And I also have a whole list of links in the appendix of things that I've drawn from for this talk. So next is to check your assumptions. And again, this is so important, because you might think that you understand something, but you might actually be completely wrong. And I'm going to use Japan as a great example here. When I was doing research there on a web page, and we were showing the participant, and she said, "Oh, this is such a luxurious use of space." And I thought, oh, that sounds so great. The participant loves our web page. And of course, my next instinct was to say, tell me more about what you mean by that. And I am so glad that I did, because then the participant said, oh, well, there's all this space here. You could add this cute little kawaii character here. You can add some more links to other things. You can add more stuff here. It wasn't a good thing. And this is why it's so important to check your assumptions. Did you understand what the participant intended? And our confirmation bias is always there and present. And so we pick up on like, oh, they really liked this thing that okay, no, just ask. Because our cultural confirmation bias is also affected by our mental models. And our mental models are really our own cultural lens. Like in the image I had before, looking at the other culture through the lens of the American flag, like that's what's going on. It helps us to interpret the world around us and make sense of how things work. But in a new culture, it doesn't always work the same way. So you have to ask more questions and be okay with being wrong. And when you notice your response, if you're having a response, it could be positive, it could be negative, but you're noticing something. What's going on? What's coming up for you? If it's a strong response, why is it so strong? And it's because you're going to pick up on things that are different. And the most important piece of this is not to judge that. It's just different. It's not better. It's not worse. I think I have this on my next slide. Yep, there it is. Because you're really it's about approaching with openness and curiosity. Openness to new ways of living and being, and just letting the participants share themselves, their lives, their stories. It's not our job to evaluate them or their culture, but we're going to ask them to evaluate the product, because it's about all of these layers of meaning making that are happening at the same time that help us to understand why something matters to them. And that was the point here. I'm all ahead of myself. Uncover what it means to them, because it's not about what we think, it's about what they think. And then it's about putting together, as we're doing the analysis, starting to put together the common themes that are coming up. And you might see these themes across different cultures, and that's totally okay. And it's also okay if they don't show up as common themes across different cultures. There's a concept called thick description that's really important here. Thick description refers to the researcher's task of both describing and interpreting observed social action or behavior within its particular context. And this is what's going on when we are doing cross-cultural research. We're observing social interactions, or we're having a conversation with people and asking them about what it means. And then as a researcher, we're going to use thick description to describe what happened and our interpretation of it. It's not simply a matter of amassing relevant detail. Rather, to thickly describe social action is actually to begin to interpret it, be it recording the circumstances, meanings, intentions, strategies, motivations, and so on that characterize a particular episode. It is this interpretive characteristic of description rather than detail per se that makes it thick. This is a tricky concept, but essentially what we're really trying to understand is having a thick description of something is multidimensional, and it's something that is important to help to understand and then interpret what's going on for the participants. And this is the last part of it here, is really to up-level your localization. And localization can actually happen in different levels, from the translation all the way to localization. But the goal would be to build products that reflect the authentic values and needs that are coming up for your participants in that other market. It should feel like it belongs. It should feel like it's something that establishes trust. And this is where nuances and details really matter, because if you get something wrong, you could turn off people to your product unknowingly. And that's where it's really important to go beyond simply translation to something a little bit deeper. But there's this double-edged sword that happens where you have kind of like a copy-paste translation of your product from English into French or Japanese or German. You can just copy paste it, translate it, and say, okay, it's going to be good. And what happens is, it's less expensive to do that. It saves you a lot of time. You can hopefully reuse or just use your existing code base. And on the flip side, by just copy pasting it into a new language, it could seem like the product is irrelevant. Or even worse, it could feel like it's culturally imperialist. A lot of times I've heard people say like, oh, yeah, this is an American product. And then they'll compare it to their local competitors. And the local competition is there. It's a competitor for a reason, because it was developed in that local market. And so it feels authentic to them. And it feels like it was designed for us, not for those other people over there. Of course, doing a fully localized product takes a lot more money, it takes time, it's less transferable, and you might have to build a separate code base. So obviously you don't want to do that either. And the user-centered design process is actually what helps us get from one to the other, but it helps us to actually build something in the middle. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here, because we can't build separate products for every market in the world. That's not going to make business sense. But we also can't just copy paste it and think it's going to be okay either, because that can come across in the wrong way. So doing a little bit of this kind of research is actually going to help a lot in order to not feel like it's imperialist or irrelevant, but to feel like it solves the needs in an authentic way. I'm going to pause here in case there was any follow-up questions on that point.
None coming through on chat, but I think you're giving us a lot to think about. So maybe they'll come through in a minute.
Good. Good. Well, I'm almost done, so we can have a conversation about it soon. Because I'm going to end with the ending from David Foster Wallace's commencement speech, and I'm going to change it slightly to a we. We get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. And there's a couple aspects of this that I think are really important. Number one is that the process of understanding people in other countries and other cultures is something that we do together. And it's something that a team of people need to work on. It's something that we do with that participant. It's something that we, researcher participant, understand and create that meaning. And we get to decide like what matters for the product and what doesn't matter. And I'm not saying to ever say like, oh, well, this person said this thing and that doesn't matter. It's important to understand the context and why it matters, because in the end, we're trying to build products that solve real human needs in authentic ways. They're going to help them to solve that problem. A lot of the time, we're building products to perceived needs that don't exist. And as researchers, we've probably all had this experience of trying to like fit the square peg in the round hole of like, well, we have this product that does this, people must need it. Therefore, we're going to do research to find out what people need. And it's not fun to hear that people don't actually need what we're building. So then the conversation translates into how do we turn that product into something that people do need because it solves a problem that they actually have. And this works in a single culture, and this works across multiple cultures at the same time, which is of course why the realm of product research and strategy and UX and design is so fascinating and fun for all of us, probably why we're all doing it. And so adding this international cross-cultural layer only enriches the user population. And it's really an element of inclusive design, because the more stories we hear from different people around the world, the better we're going to build products that actually solve their needs. So, thank you very much. I'm just going to go quickly through. I have contact information if you want to connect with me online, talk about any of these things more. We have a Q&A happening soon, and I'm very excited for that. I have some more cultural theory links. I have a whole bunch of different things that I've also used as references along the way. So you can really dig in, because as I said at the beginning, there's no single way to do this. There's your way. And just as we all have to be open and willing to find out the answers and okay to be wrong, taking growth mindset along the way, we can learn. So thank you very much.
That was awesome, Josh. Thank you so much. I know some questions will probably be coming in. I wanted to share, if you don't mind, one of my key takeaways, which is really kind of seek first to understand and then to be understood, right? And be aware of your biases, your unconscious biases, as well as your confirmation biases. And I think one of the biggest learnings I had here is all the questions that I need to ask when I think about it. And really, those questions are to drive relevance. And I don't know if you know this, Josh, but I'm a CX researcher, so I do NPS all the time. And I could not help but just really laugh at this one, because it's like, relevance. Yeah, let's talk about relevance. And, even in the United States, what does that mean? So So sharing that with everyone. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat for Josh. I'm presenting now, so I actually can't see chat. So maybe I will move on really quick to the last slide, and then we can see chat again. Josh, apologies for this, but we are continuing this cross-cultural research, thinking next month about improving online survey access, specifically around equitability and disabilities. So it's going to be really interesting. It's a topic that we don't get into very often, and I think one that not only is super relevant today, but may help us uncover some of those unconscious biases that we are going into survey design with. So, so that should be a really good one. And then let me escape out of here and stop sharing. Any recommendations for questions, pardon me, for Josh? Feel free to take yourself off mute if that's easier, if you don't want to type it in. Awesome. Oh, David, go ahead.
That's David.
I do have a question. So as a fellow member of the LGBTQI plus community, I also met my husband in Japan. I feel woefully unprepared engaging with that community. I am deathly allergic to drag, and I am wondering if you have any insights, because you did start the talk talking about how it's not just international borders, there are cultures within countries. And I say that also as an Australian, where we have things like the Aboriginal community, which is quite different as well. So I'd love your insights there.
I think that my point is, by also understanding and appreciating my own sense of belonging and not belonging within a culture, that there's the same thing that happens across cultures, that there is a belonging and not belonging that can happen as well. And navigating those differences is a pointer towards understanding how to approach people that are different than you.
Okay, thank you. I also have a resource that I like to give. You mentioned word meanings, and they might differ. I'm Australian, I lived in the UK, I live here in Seattle now, and I've been caught in similar sort of situations, and this is just within the Anglosphere, where things mean the opposite, or maybe subtly different things. And I'll plonk in the chat a link to some visual scales where different, like they compare the UK and the US. So I used to teach English as a second language, and I'd have someone go, all right, on a scale of amazing to terrible, where does this word fit? And I'd draw a scale, and I'd give my answers, right? Well, get this. That can differ quite a lot between different English-speaking countries. And just looking at what I put in the chat there, like the word abysmal in the UK has an average score of 1.2 versus the US is 2.5. So, I mean, you Yanks get some points for being more positive there, but outstanding, the British rank higher than the US, 9.1 versus 8.6. So, I really appreciate that you have lived and worked in these other countries. I've lived and worked in 7 countries now, and I'm perpetually confused. So it's good to know I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
I enjoyed and agreed with everything you said.
Thank you.
And that time thing you mentioned about Brazil, because I moved from Japan to Vietnam, and Japan is monochronic time. I'm actually German Australian, so always on time. On time is 5 minutes late. You need to be 5 minutes early. And yeah, Vietnam, Brazil, China, polychronic time. Yeah.
All right, with that question, and I'm going to build into Anna's question, excuse me, which is, what do you do when you are short on time and also have a need to get insights quickly from lots of cultures? Is it better to give it a go and realize that you're not going to get it all right? Or would you say it's better just to say that you're not going to do anything outside of your home culture until you can do it right?
There's so many layers here. Because my first reaction is, if you're short on time, I wouldn't try to spread myself too thin across lots of different cultures. I would try to like focus on what I do have time for and learn something, because research doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we're always adding to our body of knowledge about what is true. Also, language and culture and people change over time too. So what was true 3 years ago isn't necessarily true now, though there's general some things like still typically true. So I think that in general, it would be try to learn what you can and know that you're going to come back to it, and that this isn't a one and done type of situation. It's really a ongoing conversation and an opportunity to learn and grow over time. And that's, I think, the key here, because we're not going to learn everything about a culture from one study, but then if you do multiple studies over time, you're going to learn a lot more.
I feel like we can say that about your presentation today, Josh.
Hmm.
I feel like we broached the iceberg. We got some really good context, but now we gotta dig in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, and like
Yeah.
it's a personal journey for each of us.
I think that might be it for questions. I know a lot of people were high-fiving and or hands up, hearting all of that. So I think really, really good content today. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, Jasmine?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hi, really enjoyed your presentation, Josh.
Thank
I
you.
have kind of questions around, so I work at a gaming company within our consumer and market research kind of sector. And one thing that I also was trying to think about is that our game is definitely immersed in sort of the nerd culture space. And that's sort of its own culture that has, a lot of norms. And I think what's interesting about trying to figure out where our product fits is understanding sort of that across lots of different places. We are a multinational brand. And I was wondering, how do you, or have you approach dealing with sort of cultures within cultures? Of how do you kind of go about, if differently in any way, dealing with subcultures within a completely different culture altogether? Because I can see similarities, right? There might be cultural things that we share as nerds kind of in different places. But is there anything that you've done to kind of navigate that sort of space?
Yeah, a great example, we're lucky enough to do a lot of research in the LGBT community in the USA, but we also do that research in other countries internationally as well. So that's a great example of like culture within a culture. And I like to think of it as kind of like either Venn diagram or like circles within circles, because I think it's important to approach each subculture separately, kind of of its own thing, because they're going to be inherent traits that come from the reference culture, and then there's going to be specifics to the subculture. And so it's really about understanding what the relationship is between those dynamics and what is true for everybody versus what's just true for the subculture. And there might be a couple subcultures in the same broader culture. If you use nerds, I'm a nerd, but I'm not a video gaming nerd. I am a board gaming nerd. So I have like a little Venn diagram overlap, but it's not a very big overlap with the gaming community. And so that's a Mia example, but I think it's about approaching each one as if it were separate, but then looking at the relationship between each of themselves.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Awesome. I like that Venn diagram and circles within circles, because I think that applies to a lot of research that we do, whether it's cross-culturally or or any of the demographics that we think about, or how we approach kind of the different need states that we're serving with our products and offerings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, you are fantastic. Can you come back
Thank
again
you.
sometime?
I will come back anytime. I enjoy our conversations so much, and I have enjoyed putting this presentation together so much. I'm kind of passionate about it.
That the best researchers are. They absolutely are. And I think you're speaking to a lot of folks who are pretty passionate about what we do too.
Yeah.
So we definitely connect on that level.
Can talk about Paris syndrome anytime.
Well, we've got your contact information. Watch out.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Thank you. All right. Well, should we say bonsoir, mon ami?
Bonsoir. Bonsoir à vous.
Bonsoir. All right. Thank you, everyone. It was so good to see you.